A year and a half ago, I sewed the first ever thing that I could actually realistically wear, which was the first ever petticoat for my 1890s winter walking ensemble. I've gotten a lot of use out of it, but because I've worn it so often, I realized that there's a few things that I would change if I were to make it again. So I thought, now that I'm making an 1890s lounging ensemble for inside wear, I wanted to make a slightly lighter petticoat to wear underneath my wrap dress. I decided to remake my first ever petticoat, and you can see a bit of a sneak preview to how that turned out behind me here. It's kind of neat to look back on the first project I ever made, and even though I haven't been sewing very seriously in the last year and a half, just with the better tools that I have, and I have some really cool gadgets I can't wait to show you on my antique sewing machine that made this petticoat so much faster and so much easier to make. And I also have some really cool things about knitting that I will share with you on this petticoat a little bit later. So let's get right into how I made this petticoat again. Because I already spent 2 videos previously talking about the nitty-gritty construction details of this particular petticoat, I'm not going to go into that again this time. I'm just going to point out the differences that made this time seem so much easier and so much faster to put this petticoat together. One of the biggest differences is that I now have an antique sewing machine which has some really interesting attachments that are meant specifically for making things like pintucks on petticoats go much quicker. I love this antique 1894/1895 Willcox and Gibbs sewing machine, and I'm just going to leave you with some beautiful shots of how well this absolute workhorse of a machine can work on really long seams and just absolutely grind through them. I love this machine. I hope you enjoyed some of those slow motion cinematic shots of my sewing machine really doing the work on all of these seams. But one thing that really was a huge improvement is the fact that it has this attachment called the improved tucker. This is an original attachment that you could purchase with the Willcox and Gibbs machine, and I'm pretty excited because the one that I was able to get still has the original factory sample of the Pintucks that could be made using this attachment. I was pretty intimidated by this attachment at first, but it is much simpler to use than it looks. It's attached to the cloth plate of the machine, and you use 2 knobs to adjust both how far apart your tucks will be marked, as well as how wide your tucks will be. The knob adjusts how wide your actual tuck will be, so how much of a fold over you're going to have and how thick that will be. The second knob can be used to adjust how far apart this attachment will mark your tucks. So this is the distance between the tucks that it'll make. Using the tuck marker adds a bit of friction to the machine, so I usually have to give it a little bit of an assisted push when I start it off, and it is also quite a bit louder because you're knocking against that tucker that's creating that crease line for you to sew on. Very experienced people can just use the crease created by the tuck marker, fold it over, and go right on to the next tuck. However, when I was doing my final finished petticoat and not these samples, I did decide to use that as an ironing guide and iron those lines first before coming back to the machine and sewing it down. This is a sample that I decided to use as the reference for putting the pintucks on my petticoat. I like the distance between the tucks as well as the thickness of the tucks, and I moved from that directly to making the tucks on the flounce of my petticoat. Originally, the flounce only had 6 tucks at the bottom and no other tucks anywhere else on the petticoat, but I decided that with this machine it was so much easier and actually a lot of fun to make these tucks that I put 6 tucks at the bottom of the flounce, 3 tucks at the top of the flounce, and 3 tucks at the bottom of the top portion of the petticoat. So I really went a little bit overboard maybe with the pin tucks, but it was just so much fun to use this attachment. I tried to find any excuse I could to use it more. Now that my pintucks were added to my flounce, it was time to gather up the top. I did it last time with a machine, but I didn't really like how those gathers looked, so I decided instead to use Morgan Donner's technique of a double needle I definitely needed some more practice in handling 2 needles at the same time. This was very difficult for me, but it didn't take as long as I thought it would to gather up all of these sections of flounce in order to attach them to the top part of my petticoat. Now, the basic structure of my petticoat is complete, and as you can tell, I am so happy with how this version turned out, but it did seem like it was missing something. My first petticoat, I spent a lot of time hand knitting trim in order to go around the bottom of the petticoat, and it added such a personal touch that I felt was really missing from this petticoat. However, since I was working on this petticoat as a break for my hands from intricate and delicate knitting, I decided to look for an alternative way to get some hand knit trims attached to the bottom of this one. As luck would have it, I found the most amazing listing for yards and yards of hand knit antique lace trim. I found this lace trim on the Mouse Chip Vintage on Etsy. It's a wonderful store and I really recommend that you check it out. This isn't sponsored or anything, but I just really enjoyed all the listings that were in her store, so I'll leave the link down below. Please do feel free to check it out. I do very much enjoy all the items she has. But what's even more fantastic is that she was willing to share the history of this particular lace trim with me. So what she knows is that this lace trim was knit in the 1890s, either by her great-great-grandmother or her great-great-grandfather's second wife, who was called the Lady. I even have a photo of her from the 1910s, and this adds so much more of a personal touch to this hand-knit lace, knowing the history and the story behind it, knowing when it was made and potentially by who it was knit. Just, I don't know, makes my heart sing. I really, really am appreciative that I get to have this, and I get to use this to trim my petticoat and continue the use of it on something from the 1890s. Thank you again so much to the Mouse Chip Vintage for allowing me to share the story and the history behind this hand knit lace trim, and I hope that you enjoy the way that I've decided to use this lace for my own project. I wanted to be extra sure that this lace did not drag on the ground at all, so I hemmed this petticoat even shorter by a few inches so that the lace trim would definitely hang above the ground when I was wearing the petticoat. I also inspected the hand knit lace trim very, very closely, and it does seem like this might have never been attached to anything else because it is in incredibly good condition. And I also wanted to be sure that however I stitch it on really supported the lace, as well as would make it easy for me in the future if I ever wanted to wash the petticoat. I would definitely remove the lace before I do that. I know I spoke previously in another video about washing my items that have hand knit lace and how I don't want to do that, but I think this is one huge exception that I want to make, and I think that this particular bit of lace needs to be treated differently than the ones I made personally. As I was spending a lot of up close and personal time with this lace trim, as I was hand stitching it onto my petticoat, something struck me as incredibly familiar about a few sections of this lace. And that's when it hit me. The lace trim that I had knit a year and a half ago to go on the bottom of my petticoat from an 1892 knitting pattern book was the exact same pattern as this original antique lace trim. It just gave me such chills to realize that over 100 years ago, someone else had thought to use the exact same pattern that I did, and I will now be using it to trim my new petticoat. It just feels like it was really meant to be. I also really enjoyed comparing the most recent remake of this petticoat to an antique petticoat that I own, which you can see here on the right. Whoever made this original antique petticoat also hand knit a lot more lace than I've ever done, so props to that person because that's absolutely amazing. But also the Pintucks are much smaller and closer together than even my most recent remake. However, I still think that the most recent version of this petticoat captures the light and airy feel of the antique original much better than the first petticoat that I made, which definitely has a bit of a heavier, thicker, more dragging quality rather than light and airy yet still structured. Now, this first petticoat that I made will still be going to a lot of good use. I will be making some modifications to it to make it wearable in the future. I know some of you might have been wondering if I remade it, will I now get rid of my first petticoat? But I am still planning to use it a lot in the future after I make some modifications to make it easier for me to wear. But I do think it's interesting to compare exactly how the first petticoat looks and moves while I wear it in comparison to how this most recent petticoat I made looks and wears. It is so light and airy, yet structured. The twirl factor is absolutely amazing. I can't stop twirling and spinning when I have this petticoat on. I really like how the small details really came together in this petticoat, and I also really like that I took the time to pleat the back of the skirt into the waistband. I really like the even structure that it adds rather than gathering it in, and that I hand braided the cord to tie on this petticoat because it ties in a little bit of that red color to match the rest of the outfit as well. I know that the antique lace also is slightly yellowed from age, but I personally really like how that looks against the stark white and calls attention to the fact that I have an antique piece attached to something new that I made. I really enjoyed making this petticoat again. It was such a fun experience in comparison to the first time where it seemed like quite intense work. And I'm so glad that you decided to watch this with me. Thank you so much. If you enjoyed it, please feel free to give it a like. If you like videos like this and are looking forward to more of the unique, small, interesting knits that I have planned and will show you, and hopefully the stockings with a pattern that I'll show you sometime really soon, feel free to subscribe, and I will see you again next time. Bye.